The greatest benefactor from that debate of whether or not Netanyahu is injecting politics into his decisions was Hamas. There's been a lot of information that's come out to show that Hamas not only benefited from it, that they promoted it, that they pushed for that line. I don't believe for a second that any prime minister of Israel would put Israeli soldiers into harm's way just because they wanted to stay in power a little bit longer.
Welcome to the Misgav Institute for National Security's Mideast Horizons, the podcast for anyone who wants to truly understand what's happening in the Middle East beyond the headlines and spin. I'm Lahav Harkov, your co-host, a Misgav Institute Senior Fellow and Senior Political Correspondent for Jewish Insider.
And I'm Asher Fredman, your co-host, Executive Director of the Misgav Institute for National Security and a Visiting Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. The Misgav Institute is Israel's leading national security policy center dedicated to strengthening Israel's security, its regional integration, and its international alliances. Each week here on Mideast Horizons, we cut through the noise in the shallow discourse to bring you fresh insights into the most critical issues on the Israeli and Middle East national security agenda.
Please subscribe and follow wherever you listen to podcasts to keep up to date and ahead of the curve on everything connected to Israel and the Middle East. You can reach out to us with comments and suggestions at mideasthorizonspodcast@gmail.com.
And we read your comments and questions and your suggestions, so please keep sending them. Lav, I think we should begin this week with what we saw yesterday in Florida, the two press conferences between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump, touching on all the most critical issues facing Israel and the Middle East today. What was your impression? What were your takeaways?
So first of all, my first takeaway is that Trump and Netanyahu looked as friendly as usual. It seems like every time Netanyahu heads to the White House, there's all these news stories with anonymous sources about how mad Trump is at Netanyahu, and that basically never seems to be the case. Even the one time that it looked like it was the case, shortly after the U.S. and Israel cooperated on bombing Iran. So clearly they were working well together.
It's true. But I don't know if it's perhaps somebody in the White House intentionally or for whatever reason feeding this one particular report of these stories, and then it gets recycled in all different news platforms, or whether it's just people, hoping that there's a rift between Netanyahu and Trump, so they're hoping to make it true by reporting it. I don't know.
Look, we've talked at length about some of the negative trends towards Israel within the American right, and I think that some version of that is obviously represented within the White House, but clearly whoever that person is not the most influential person in the White House, right? And so it makes sense for there to be some diversity of views and voices within the White House. It doesn't make sense that the same news outlets keep using that same person's view again and again to try to represent the Trump administration position. And I don't know why the editors haven't pointed that out, but we should stop. We're being purposefully vague. Let's talk about Tachlis, which is the substance of what came out of the meeting. So let's start with Gaza, right? We've also talked, I feel like for 2 months already practically, about how Hamas needs to be disarmed and Gaza needs to be demilitarized. And when is that going to happen already? And Trump seems to be using the same kind of language, like it has to happen or it won't be pretty for Hamas. There'll be consequences. But still as vague as he was, when the ceasefire went into place in the beginning of October. He also claimed that 59 countries would want to take part in disarming Hamas. And I am skeptical because that's not what the countries that are part of this coalition have been saying, right? They view themselves as a peacekeeping force. And to disarm Hamas, you're going to have to fight.
Absolutely. And I don't think any other country other than Israel is going to take military action against Hamas, even if they're willing to put troops on the ground as some kind of UNIFIL-style peacekeeping force. And as you said, that's what we've heard from the King of Jordan, from the President of Indonesia, being clear about the limits of what their armed forces might do.
Jordan, by the way, they are not actually part of these forces. They haven't all this is often the case with the King of Jordan. He has plenty to say and plenty of criticism for other people, but is not actually stepping up himself or, having his people step up.
I have to say, I'm reading now Walter Isaacson's biography of Steve Jobs, and
Mm.
he describes one of the ways that Steve Jobs was so effective at how did he get the Macintosh to become a reality and revolutionize the computer world was by essentially, in a sense, distorting reality, but not in a bad sense, in a sense where he is so clear and so certain and so communicating so resolutely that a certain thing can happen, must happen, will happen, that in the end it did happen. Now, I think that might be the tactic that President Trump is using because, let's be honest, again and again, he's done things, whether it's the Abraham Accords, whether it is winning the release of all the remaining hostages except for one who's still being held, while Israel remains in 53% of Gaza, whether it's other, I'm talking specifically about the Israel arena, the bombing Fordo in Iran, which nobody thought that a U.S. president would do, moving the administration to Jerusalem. Now, I agree with you entirely. I don't think that Indonesia or foreign countries are going, other Arab or Muslim countries are going to send troops that are going to actually come and fight Hamas. But I do think that one of Trump's strategies, which, like it or not, has proven effective in the past, is to present his version of reality. And at times, that vision of reality or version of reality actually becomes reality.
I think you're right about that, but I think that it's been a few months and it hasn't worked yet. He's not succeeded in strong-arming these countries into doing what he wants. So, and Hamas has just so, maybe not fully, but like has reconstituted itself a lot, like really significantly in the half of Gaza that it now really controls. And, as the longer we wait to actually disarm Hamas, the longer we return to the closer we get to an October 6th reality. Maybe we're only in a 2006, 2007, 2008 reality and not the reality where Hamas was really frequently shooting rockets into Israel, right? But if you don't do anything about it, then they'll go back to doing what they did before.
And there's no vacuum. Things aren't static. I mean, there are something that the Misgav Institute has been working on. There are hundreds, thousands of trucks coming into the Gaza Strip on a daily basis.
And this morning, Ynet had like extensive reporting on how Hamas has been looting the food that goes into Gaza.
And even if you have these inspection protocols, they're not hermetic. And when you have hundreds of thousands or thousands of trucks going in, Hamas has the ability to smuggle in dual-use materials, which it can use for its military, even before we send in huge amounts of reconstruction material. Even today, and I can say, this is something that the Misgav Institute has been working on with some of the relevant decision makers, is improving those protocols and ensuring that less materials are able to be smuggled into Gaza. But we shouldn't ignore the reality that as we speak, Hamas, perhaps slowly, but is not just reasserting its control, but rebuilding its military capabilities.
Yeah, and there's some reporting that President Trump wants to start reconstruction of Gaza even before Hamas is disarmed. And the more reconstruction happens, the more those dual-use items, which, just to clarify for listeners that don't understand, dual-use meaning it can be used for civilian means, but it could also be used for weapons. And construction materials especially can often be used for weapons and clearly can be used for tunnels, right? The tunnels are supposed to be wiped out as well. It's really disconcerting. I mean, to me, like, I look at this war that we fought for 2 years, that you actually fought it. I was, maybe on the front lines of the communications battle, but we fought it for the hostages for sure. But we also fought it so that Hamas is no longer a threat to Israel. And I feel like so much of what Israel accomplished in those 2 years is starting to be rolled back. And I just fear that it's going to get worse. It's hard for me to be optimistic. I'm usually an optimistic person, but it's hard for me to be optimistic at this point. I keep thinking of when Vice President Vance visited Israel. I think it was in November, and he said that we need to be patient. And at the time I said, okay, fine. We Israelis are not very good at being patient. Maybe he's right. But when does that end?
I think President Trump also said something about how giving second chances, that Israel doesn't really want to give second chances and they feel they should give second chances. But I think it was clear that President Trump is also, I would say, maybe getting exasperated by Hamas and continues to maintain that Hamas committed to him, or I guess to Jared Kushner, to Steve Witkoff, that they were going to disarm. He also I didn't hear any deadline or sort of time frame from him about how quickly he wants to see the move. He didn't say disarmament needs to happen before we move to phase two. But he also didn't say phase two needs to begin, the next 2 weeks or the next month or, as soon as possible. So there also I think that was a positive development. The other positive, surprising and I think very positive development was his clear statements on Iran, specifically the ballistic missile threat, where he said he would absolutely support, he actually said twice that he would absolutely support Israel if it chose to go to war in order to take out once again, degrade once again, the ballistic missile threat, which we know that Iran is working to rebuild its ballistic missile capabilities. He said that if it was if they saw that Iran was rebuilding its nuclear capabilities, he would act fast. But he was very clear about the ballistic missile capabilities as well. And also that's another issue that has been reported as an area where there's gaps, where there's daylight between Israel and the United States. At least yesterday at the press conference, we didn't hear anything like that.
I think it was pretty unequivocal in saying that he's concerned about Iran reconstituting both programs, both the ballistic missile program and the nuclear program, about which he said, where there's smoke, there's fire, right? There's all this reporting that they're trying to rebuild and they're looking for ways to do it. And he believes that they're actually doing it, which compared to some other presidents that the U.S. has had in the past 20 years, that's good. It's good that he actually knows that there's a threat and is aware of it and is supportive of Israel acting to stop that threat. So, whether that means something's going to happen in the short term, it's hard to say, but it's clear that Israel's very concerned about this and seems to have gotten the answer it wants from Trump. So that's definitely like one success that Netanyahu can pocket from this visit.
Now, when he was asked about regime change, he said, I don't want to talk about that, but we can't ignore the internal situation in Iran. I think inflation hit 20% in December this month. The governor of the central bank just quit. The state budget that was proposed was rejected by the Majlis, by the Iranian parliament, because they thought it was too optimistic. It didn't take into account inflation. And then we're seeing once again the protests in various different locations on the ground. And I think President Trump's remarks here also were revealing, because he talked about how he's no illusions about the regime, talked about how the regime, every time there's people protesting the regime, comes out and starts killing them. But he also, I think, correctly his approach is that the United States, Israel can't do it. It has to be the people. And until the people are able to reach that critical mass where they're able to overthrow the regime or build a better future for themselves, the unfortunate fact is that the regime managed to keep suppressing these protests by force, that it's going to be very hard for any external actors to make that happen or even to set that as a goal. Now, obviously, I do think there are things that the United States, certainly Israel, can do in terms of communications, in terms of access to the internet, in terms of even moral support. But in the end of the day, it is going to have to be, we're going to have to wait to see whether or not the economic instability that we see and whether or not the protests that we see do reach that boiling point, which really does threaten the stability of the regime.
Yeah, I agree with that sentiment. A lot of the Iran experts I've spoken to for my reporting have also said that, ultimately, the people of Iran need to get organized. The different factions need to work together if they want to bring down the regime. And I think we just see that around the world, right? That, sort of externally caused coups are not necessarily stable. They're not really the way to go. I don't think anyone should regret getting rid of Gaddafi or contributing to the fall of Gaddafi, but Libya has been a basket case ever since, just to give one example in the region. And Iran is a much bigger sort of power in the region, and so it's a much bigger challenge in that way, right? It would be hard to find a way to bring in a truly stable government from the outside. And there's different diaspora. Iran is also really interesting because they have this extremely strong diaspora with a lot of anti-regime movements in the diaspora. And there are often questions of how strong their actual connection is to the people who still live in Iran. Something to keep an eye on.
Absolutely. Where there is obviously clear disagreement between Israel and the United States and between Netanyahu and Trump is with regards to Turkey and with Erdogan. And President Trump continues to see him as a partner and as a friend, I think. And from Israel's perspective, not only has he been engaging in wildly anti-Semitic and very extreme rhetoric against Israel, but there are real concerns that this could become, down the road, if not tomorrow, a military threat, including by Turkey's attempts to establish itself and establish military bases in Syria. And I think that is actually something it was less reported on, but in the context of Israel's recognition of Somaliland, actually, which I think was a very bold diplomatic move, in Israel being the first country in the globe, in the world, the first UN member state to make that recognition, I think shows real diplomatic initiative. And I think there are a number of different reasons why that was good from a strategic perspective. One reason is because Turkey's largest base outside of Turkey is in Somalia. It's called Turksam, I believe. And perhaps in the future, when military tensions between Israel and Turkey grow, and Turkey perhaps attempts to establish itself to Israel's north in Syria, it may be good to have an established and expanded Israeli presence in Somaliland on the border with Somalia.
I have a lot to say about Somaliland, but I want to just go back to focus on Turkey a little more, because one of the things that President Trump said was that he's strongly considering selling Turkey F-35s, and that's a big concern. Israel really opposes that, and Israel considers that degrading its qualitative military edge, which is something that's in American law that the U.S. has to help Israel maintain, right? Its military edge in the region. What's interesting is that it was the Trump administration that removed Turkey from the F-35 program, right, in 2019, because Turkey had bought Russian surface-to-air missile systems, which was a violation of the conditions. And I don't think that that's changed, right? Turkey is not any less friendly with Russia than it was before. It didn't get rid of those systems as far as I know. Maybe part of what changed is that Trump no longer has as many Russia hawks in his administration as he did in the first administration, but it still doesn't make sense in a broad, not just for Israel, right? We know why Israel opposes it. You talked about that, but it still doesn't make so much sense for the US, right? There's still a security risk there. But moving on to Somaliland, Somaliland is this really interesting country that sort of broke off from Somalia 35 years ago, and they're this sort of plucky little democracy that's been stable and has stable transitions of power after elections, while Somalia, right next door, or the vast majority of the world considers it the same country, but I'm all for Israel recognizing it. Somalia next door is a total basket case. Literally, if people want to give an example of like the most war-torn, unstable places in the world, they say Mogadishu, right? And so this idea it's just crazy to me that nobody else has thought that Somaliland should be acknowledged. I don't know. You don't have to go so far as recognizing them as a state, but at least treat them like Taiwan, right? Which I also think should be recognized as a state, but fine, I understand. China has a lot more leverage on other countries than Somalia does, so fine, I get what the realpolitik reasons. And I think for Israel, of course, this is not, so that's my sort of neocon freedom agenda view of Somaliland. But for Israel specifically, it's strategically really important. There's all these satellite photos that look like some sort of very advanced military bases being built in Somaliland on the shores of the Aden Basin of the Red Sea, right? So Somaliland is just a few hundred kilometers by sea from Yemen, from the areas that are being held by the Houthis. And Israel, for a lot of the war, was sort of stumped by what to do about the Houthi problem. Certainly things from Yemen have quieted down. There haven't been a lot of missiles since the summer when Israel took out a lot of the Houthi leadership. And then also with the ceasefire, I don't think there's been any missiles since the ceasefire with Gaza. So the Houthis sort of kept their word in the sense when it comes to why they said they're attacking Israel. But that doesn't mean that Israel's going to rest on its laurels and think we don't have a threat anymore. So strategically, I think it is important for Israel to have some kind of forward base, maybe a secret forward base, close to Yemen.
I think it's just an example of, the reaction, the international reaction was an example of sort of the calcified conventional thinking. Like you're saying, you have essentially an independent entity that is a democratic functioning, peaceful entity, and then the idea that it must remain under this totally dysfunctioning entity, which has been overrun on several occasions by Islamist terrorists. Besides having the largest Turkish base there, Mogadishu and Somalia as a whole is becoming deeper and deeper under Chinese influence. The Chinese are investing very heavily in Somalia. Iran is looking to establish bases in the area. There are a lot of good reasons from an Israeli and Western perspective, Qatari's perspective, why you would want an independent Somaliland. Also, we can't forget that the largest Chinese naval base in Djibouti is just slightly to the north of Somaliland, and having an expanded American and Israeli presence in Somaliland, in the port of Berbera, could be beneficial. Whether or not the U.S. should go ahead and recognize it's a separate question, but certainly there should be this openness to, as we saw the Abraham Accords, thinking outside the box, not necessarily just accepting the sort of the international conventions as a holy cow, as a holy grail, something that you can't challenge. And I think Israel did that in this case.
Yeah, I think so. By the way, the Somaliland government is now sort of lobbying in the U.S. in Washington to try to get recognition or at least some sort of increased cooperation with the U.S. I mean, that clearly is part of what was in it for them from Israel, for, having relations with Israel. So we'll see where that goes moving forward. And I mentioned the Qataris before, right? The Qataris are supporting they're supporting the Islamists in Somalia. Surprise, surprise, Qatari supporting Islamists. But the UAE supports Somaliland. They didn't recognize them officially. And when I started getting, as someone who works for a Washington-based news outlet, I get a lot of these like PR pitches that are meant for people in Washington, basically. And I noticed that the same people doing the Somaliland public relations in Washington are doing the UAE's public relations in Washington. And so probably not a coincidence. I can't imagine the government of Somaliland has a lot of funds for PR.
So we're recording one day after the Trump-Netanyahu meeting in Florida. And we have this week somebody who was really in the room when it happens, who sat in on numerous meetings between Prime Minister Netanyahu and American presidents. Lahav, do you want to introduce him?
Sure. Ari Harow is an American-born Israeli who was an advisor to Prime Minister Netanyahu, first in 2006 as the head of American Friends of Likud, and then he was Netanyahu's foreign affairs advisor in 2007 as bureau chief, and continued working for him through Netanyahu's return to the prime minister's office in 2009. Then he returned to government in 2014 and was Netanyahu's chief of staff for a year, including Operation Protective Edge. And he is here on the podcast to speak to us about what it's like behind the scenes during meetings between Israeli prime ministers and American presidents.
And we have to recall Ari Harow was Prime Minister Netanyahu's chief of staff during the whole tension with the Obama administration around the Iran deal, the JCPOA. So this will be a very informative conversation. So stay tuned for this wide-ranging conversation with Ari Harow. Ari Harow, it's great to see you. Thank you for joining Misgav Mideast Horizons.
It's great to see you, Asher. It's great to see you, Lahav. It's been a while.
It's been a while, and you're one of the people who really, since the mid-2000s, spent a lot of time with Prime Minister Netanyahu as opposition leader, as prime minister, specifically in the roles related to foreign relations, related to foreign affairs. I think most of our listeners probably watched the press conference before the meeting with Trump, the press conference after the meeting with Trump. What really happens when the cameras go off and leaders go into that room, just them, their senior teams? What's that dynamic like? What really happens then?
I think that it's important when you think about foreign policy to recognize that there are, I would say, three key components that come into play. One of them is policy, the other is politics, and the third is personal, okay? The three Ps. And depending on who is in the room, the focus can be on one of those three, or it could be in all three of those three. And the dynamic that you saw yesterday and the dynamic that we've seen since Trump's return to office is one where all three Ps are, quite frankly, tremendously aligned. You see it in the body language, you see it in the terminology, and in the showering of praise in both directions. And you see it in the policies that both countries agree upon as they move forward with the very busy neighborhood that we live in. So I think that as opposed to many of the naysayers and many of the protagonists here and abroad that were expecting the floor to fall out under the feet of our two leaders, we saw something quite the opposite, and it's something that we should have been expecting, and I'm glad things played out the way that I did expect.
How much of these meetings is sort of preordained in a way? Like, I know a lot of it is planned in advance, but like, how much of it do you go in basically knowing what's going to happen, and how much is going to surprise you?
So again, everything that I say really depends on the two leaders and the two countries and the complexity of the issues that are at hand. The relationship that we've seen between the United States and Israel, again, I'll differentiate between past administrations and the current administration, is not only very warm, but it's very deep and ongoing. So the regularity of discussions between the prime minister's team and the president's team are something that what you try and do is leave as little as possible for question when you walk into that room. You want to try and make sure that at least the bigger issues are discussed prior to the meeting. You want to make it as easy as possible for the leaders to reach the goals that they've set for themselves. And in this specific case, because of the extent of the relationship that the Israeli team has with Trump's team, I think that there's very little that you come into and are surprised with. One thing that's important to note is that I'm quite confident in this. This is the first meeting that the Prime Minister of Israel has had with any U.S. president in the last 17 years. That number one, that Ron Dermer was not present in the meeting for, and number two, was not actively involved in the preparation of the meetings.
Why do you think he wasn't involved in the behind-the-scenes preparation?
I purposely said that he was not actively involved because he wasn't. These are the types of trips, as you recall from even past trips that have taken place this year. This was the sixth meeting between the leaders this year. In past trips, Ron Dermer would get on a plane, a week before the meeting, two weeks before the meeting. He would spend many hours with the president and his team, preparing them for what Israel's stance is, trying to find common ground and make it as smooth as possible. I'm quite confident that while he is a resource that is still valuable to the prime minister, he was not as actively involved, and that I can say with certainty.
Was there ever a time where, despite all the preparations, you recall that you sat down and either Netanyahu or the American president said something that totally, upended the preparations, that totally surprised you, that wasn't in the cards?
Unfortunately, it's happened many a time. There's no question. I mean, the most, I would say, surprising that I remember was probably the first trip that Netanyahu made after being reelected in 2009, shortly after President Obama was elected in the United States. They had met a number of times before either of them were in office. So this was the first official meeting as president and prime minister. And at the end of that meeting, the meeting started off with the structured policy issues that both sides had prepared for. And at the end of the meeting, President Obama asked both sides to give them the room, meaning leave President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu alone. And when Prime Minister Netanyahu came out of that room, I saw the face of pure shock on his face. And later in conversation, it became clear that President Obama had said the now famous "not one brick" statement to him.
Just for our listeners who might not recall that, could you explain what that was?
Sure. So again, we have to remember this is shortly after Netanyahu returns to power after 10 years in political exile, and he returns to power as the head of the largest right-wing party. Now that's significant because this is not that long after the disengagement from Gaza, and from a domestic political perspective, having the support of the settlement movement, the residents of Judea and Samaria, is critical for Netanyahu's political stability here in Israel. Arriving in Washington and having President Obama say not one brick, in essence, what he's saying is the United States does not want Israel to take on any new building in Judea and Samaria. President Obama and his team saw Judea and Samaria as occupied territories that needed to be negotiated upon. And obviously, beyond the ideological conflicts that may have arisen from that, the political quandary was significant for the prime minister. And in essence, that sort of set the tone for the relationship between the United States and President Obama's 8 years in office.
You were part of the team, right, that was supposed to be preparing Netanyahu for the meeting. What do you do in a scenario like that? Like, I'm also thinking about, I guess it's 10 months ago now. I was in the White House when President Trump started going on and on about Gazans emigrating, right, to other countries, and they'll rebuild Gaza Riviera. And you could tell there on Netanyahu's face that he was shocked as well, although it was a more positive shock. And so in that moment, one of the things that I was looking at was at, Ron Dermer, Caroline Glick, and all those people in the audience to see, like, what are they going to do? So what was that like for you?
So, you know what? I tell my kids, I generally use a sports analogy, right? That the difference between somebody that's a great player and someone that's just a good player is just repetition, right? And it's true in most areas of life. Someone who has experience and who's seen different scenarios over and over and over again is generally going to respond and react better than someone who's seeing it for the first time. From that perspective, I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu, again, you can be a supporter, you can be an opponent of Prime Minister Netanyahu, but he is the longest serving prime minister in the history of Israel. He's gone through diplomatic challenges with different leaders over many different situations. He's worked with 4 different U.S. presidents at this point, 4 or 5. And I think that as such, he really is somebody who has a deep understanding of how to react and how to respond in surprise situations. So number one rule is really just not to react and not to respond, and to take your time and sort of digest it and come back with a well thought out plan and response. And as I was saying, I mean, Netanyahu really is somebody who has that experience and that expertise, and always knows how to deflect and, kick it down the road for another day.
It seems that there are times where, on the one hand, maintaining strong U.S.-Israel ties is a key national security need, a requirement for Israel, and that includes ties with the administration, with the president, bipartisan ties with both parties, and with the broader American public. That can, it seems, come into a clash with sometimes Israel's security needs, whether that's the JCPOA and the Iran nuclear program, whether it might, we'll have to see what happens, but a move towards, say, a reconstruction of Gaza without Hamas being fully disarmed. I think it wasn't entirely clear where President Trump stands on that, at least from his responses to the media yesterday, about whether or not disarmament is a prerequisite for moving ahead with stage 2. It could be argued that Netanyahu's speech to Congress against the JCPOA, which was in 2014, if I'm not mistaken, he felt was critical for Israel's security, but obviously led to further worsening of relations with the administration, with Obama, and could be argued had long-term impacts with the Democratic Party as well. How does Prime Minister Netanyahu balance those two tensions, those two strategic needs between the overall need of maintaining strong ties with the United States on a bipartisan level and what could be, more immediate vital security concerns?
I think your question is a very good one, and it speaks to the complexity that any prime minister in Israel faces. It's been said before that the job of Prime Minister of Israel is the most difficult job in the world, and that's one of the reasons. Because there's a number of other facets that you didn't touch on when you look at U.S.-Israel relations. It's not just about our security needs versus the diplomatic ties between the two countries. There is the political element here in Israel, which plays into every one of those decisions. Israeli prime ministers don't stand for election every 4 years. They stand for election every day. Because of the nature of coalition politics, and even more so the nature of Israeli coalition politics, they find themselves, never more than a few hands away from losing their grip of power. And as such, every consideration that's taken, be it in how you deal with allies, how you deal with security issues, there's an element of politics that creeps in there. And obviously, there is a broader strategic interest that you take into consideration as well. There's ideological interests and so on and so forth. So I think that when you talk about the United States, and this is what's so valuable about the relationship that we're seeing today between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump, for most of Netanyahu's career as prime minister, he has found Democrats in the White House. And for obvious reasons, they didn't necessarily see eye to eye from a security perspective or from a geopolitical perspective. And in those cases, Netanyahu had to balance the immediate needs of Israel and the long-term strategic needs of Israel with the importance of the relationship between the United States and Israel. The United States remains Israel's greatest ally on so many different fronts in international diplomatic circles, be it the United Nations and other international bodies. From an economic perspective, the United States is critical to us. And I don't just mean the aid that we receive to the United States. I'm talking about as an export partner for the Israeli economy. The broader strategic, geopolitical, and security challenges that we faced. I mean, we saw that when President Trump joined in on the Israeli attacks against Iran's nuclear capacities. But we've seen that many other times. Just as an example, we can all remember the extremely scary moment of the mob overrunning the Israeli embassy in Cairo a number of years back. And you may recall that the Israeli personnel that were holed up in the embassy really had no way to escape, and they were not more than a few yards and a few minutes away from what could have been a horrific and terrible tragedy.
I think there was one locked door between them and the mob, if I recall correctly.
There was one locked door, and I believe there was maybe 1 or 2 guns held by the Israelis behind those doors. If you recall, the Prime Minister Netanyahu at the time was on the phone with the Israeli staff in that embassy. And ultimately, what saved those Israelis was our ability, the state of Israel's ability, to call on the White House, and that was during the Obama administration, to call on the White House and to get, I believe it was Secretary of State Hillary Clinton at the time, who put all of the U.S. pressure and backing against the Egyptian authorities to extract our foreign ministry employees from that predicament. So that is an example, albeit a small one, of how the relationship between the two countries can play out in different theaters and in different scenarios. Obviously, when there's I guess common ground on the 3 Ps that I mentioned before, but you're speaking to policy, then the ability to achieve not only tactical victories, but strategic ones, increases dramatically. And to your point, by the way, Asher, as far as Gaza and the dismantlement of Hamas military structure and, disarming and so on, I think it is important for us to remember, and I think from my perspective, watching the press conference last night, it's clear to see that the strategic goals of the United States and Israel are the same. There may be tactical differences, there may be chronological preferences, but ultimately, I think that the strategic goals of both countries are completely in line at this point, and that's something of great value.
I want to talk about another element of this Netanyahu trip. He's spending almost a week in Palm Beach.
He's
there was
Jewish. He's Jewish, and it's winter, so where
that
else
was the
can you go?
joke. Yeah, I made that joke when I heard the plan for the trip. I said, "Listen, he's Jewish. He's from Philly. What else is he going to do in the winter? He's in his 70s." Anyway,
You play shuffleboard.
right, exactly. Mahjong. So, he spends a day preparing for the Mar-a-Lago visit, and then he has the one-day Mar-a-Lago visit. Maybe if the reporters who are there are lucky, they'll get an hour with him, although last I've heard from some of my friends is that there's nothing planned. They're very disappointed. But what he is doing in these few days is he's meeting with evangelicals, and not been reported, but I think we all know some of his biggest supporters and donors live in the area, which is the Falak family. And I imagine as the former head of American Friends of Likud, you have some sort of personal relationship with them. So I'm not going to probe specifically about them, but how much do these visits help? You think we'll start with the evangelicals. He's supposed to have this big meeting where he's meeting with evangelical leaders. And Netanyahu is someone who I think has really prioritized Israel's relations with Christians in the U.S. As a political force. And how much do you think these kinds of meetings are helpful? And also, how different do you think the atmosphere is now with the growing right-wing extremism in the U.S. Impacting the relationship with Israel? Not the government relationship at the moment, but politically.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very, very, very important point. I tend to feel, and this is something that I've discussed with people close to the prime minister, how the success that we've seen militarily over the last year in our region has put us in a position where I think every Israeli breathes a little bit easier, knowing that obviously we still face significant challenges. The level of strategic challenge is definitely much less significant than it was, October 6th, 2023. And the reason I say that is because what we're seeing in the United States can very well be the next, if not already, right, the next real strategic threat to the Jewish people and to the state of Israel. I think the voices that we're hearing, we've sort of gotten used to the voices coming from the far left and which have penetrated the mainstream of the Democratic Party. And that, from a domestic perspective in the United States, drove many, lifelong Democrats to shift their allegiance to a party that was more supportive of Israel, that was more supportive of the Jewish people. That has started to change. That's over the last, whether it's 6 months, over the last year. Some of the voices have been around for a while. We're all familiar with them, whether it's Candace Owens or Tucker Carlson and so on and so forth. The fact, though, that it has penetrated the mainstream debate within the Republican and conservative movements is extremely alarming and presents a significant challenge not only to Jews in the United States, but to the state of Israel. So Prime Minister Netanyahu taking the time to meet with evangelical leaders who, to a certain degree, within the framework of U.S. domestic politics, are being set aside. They're being sidestepped here by, as you called them, right-wing fundamentalists or radicals with a very clear anti-Israel and anti-Semitic agenda. So anything that we as the state of Israel can do to assist, to support, and show our gratitude towards that community that remains a stalwart supporter and backer of us as the one and only Jewish state, I think is critical. As far as the Jewish community goes, I believe that that too is significant at this point. The three of us have family and friends living in the United States, and I'm sure that you hear this. I hear it all the time. People don't feel as comfortable. People don't feel as safe as Jews living in the United States, and it doesn't matter where in the United States you are. You can be in California and Los Angeles, and you wake up to the news that an ISIS cell was arrested there. You could be in New York and the incidents that took place there, and so on and so forth. So I think that strengthening the bond between the leadership of Israel, the Prime Minister of Israel, and the Jewish community that sees Israel as its protector to a certain degree and its safety net is a very, very important and very, very important act that the Prime Minister needs to do while he's there.
If you were asked to devise a strategic plan for the government of Israel, for the state of Israel, to ensure that U.S.-Israel ties in a decade from now would be just as strong or even stronger and deeper than they are today, what would be, say, the top 3 recommendations you would make for such a plan?
Wow, that's a great question, Asher. I think that we need to recognize where the United States is heading. And, something that Israel's always been great at when it comes to security thinking and strategic security steps, we need to start implementing on the diplomatic front. And what do I mean by that? One of the incidents that Israeli security thought was somewhat, was not serious. I'll put it that way. I was going to say funny, but I'll say not serious. Right? Was after the shoe bomber incident took place, right, from London to the United States. The next day, every airline and every airport in the world had you taking off your shoes, and Israeli experts looked at that and said, you're preparing for yesterday's challenge, not for tomorrow's challenge.
Just for everybody visiting Israel, you should know that when you come to the airport in Israel, you do not have to take off your shoes. That's another reason to come visit Israel.
Yeah, exactly. So, the key to any strategic planning is really looking into what challenges or what opportunities may arise in the future and not planning based on yesterday's or even today's reality. We do see part of these shifting sands in the United States tie into some very key components. One of them is the economy, right? Economic. There is definitely a much stronger voice in the United States against international aid, against spending U.S. taxpayer dollars on foreign countries and foreign entities. And this is an area that I think, to a certain degree, we can very easily align with the United States on. We are a very strong economy. We've proven it just this past year. Everyone's familiar with the article in The Economist that had Israel as the number 3 strongest economy in the world. And this is a year that we were fighting a war on 7 fronts, and we've been isolated from many countries around the world. So this has to be turned into an asset in our dealings with the United States. We are a strong partner economically, and as a result of that, the United States and the citizens of the United States not only don't have to spend their taxpayer dollars on us, but we can be of vital interest to helping them grow their economy. So that's, I think, one path forward. The second path is the path which ties into the economy, is really innovation. Israel has always been, but continues to be even more so, sort of a lab for innovation and ingenuity. And it's something that obviously the world saw on display as Iran shot hundreds and ultimately thousands of missiles at the country. The line to purchase Israeli know-how in air defense is around the block. But this is just one example. Obviously, defense tech is an area that's taken on a life of its own, and Israel is a significant player in it. But as you well know, water technologies, agriculture technologies, cybersecurity, and so on and so forth, not only do we remain at the front of the line in this type of technological development, it's something that we need to further develop in our relationship and our appeal to the people of the United States, that this is a partner that not only do you share ideological or moral values with, but this is a partner that you need if you want to retain your spot as the world superpower and the largest and best country in the world. Last but not least is stability in the region. Something that President Trump repeated ad nauseum in his press appearances yesterday was, had Israel, together with the United States, not taken out Iran's nuclear facilities, there would not be peace in the Middle East. There would be war. This is a key element that the United States governments of the future and the people of the United States have to be reminded of over and over again, that a stable Israel and a secure Israel brings stability and security to a much broader region. And that region, for the various reasons, be it energy security, be it other economic interests that the United States and military interests that the United States has throughout the Middle East and beyond, Israel is really a tremendous asset to the United States in implementing its own policies. And I think that these are three key components where we can show the United States public and any future U.S. governments that Israel is not a nice-to-have ally. It's a necessary ally, and an ally that we need to strengthen relationships with.
In order to get those messages out, right, in the United States and also other parts of the Western world, you have to have skilled communicators, you have to have a strategy, you have to have a staff. And it remains the case that Netanyahu himself is a skilled communicator, but he's extremely understaffed when it comes to other people who could do that work. And it can't just be Netanyahu himself all the time, aside from the fact that Netanyahu himself has become a very polarizing figure in the U.S. I mean, Frank, I don't think he accepts that reality, but it is true. And he needs to staff up, right? And since, I don't know, about 6 months into the war, there hasn't even been anyone who's the head of the Public Diplomacy Directorate. They employ people in like weird kind of freelance ways, and bring people on like ad hoc instead of being prepared in an emergency. Why do you think that's the case? I mean, this is a problem. People ask me this too, and I'm interested in your take as an insider, because this problem has been around for decades.
Right. Let me start off by saying that, in times of peace, prior to October 7th, you're 100% correct in the fact that the prime minister felt that his ability to appear in front of a U.S. audience, every couple months, he'd do the Sunday morning programs, do a few interviews, and he was able to convey our message to the U.S. public in a way that was much better and more efficient than anyone else could have. Obviously, he had minister and prior to that ambassador and prior to that advisor Ron Dermer as well as part of the team, who was second to the prime minister in his ability to go out there and convey these messages. And the idea really was, during those periods of time, that this is something that can be dealt with a limited staff. And there's others. Mark Regev was involved and a number of others. But this is something that can be successfully implemented with that limited staff. Obviously, a time of war proves that that does not work. The prime minister, forget about his ability to speak to the people and whether or not he is somewhat alienated in the United States. He's busy. He's busy running a war. He's busy running a country, and he can't be worried about, appearing on this or that television program. And I think that is something that has to a certain degree, penetrated the leadership here in Israel and the way that they look at this challenge. We have seen positive steps with Gideon Sa'ar, the foreign minister, since he took office. He's been very, very active on that front and has expanded our outreach, both as far as spokespeople and how we deal with this whole issue of public diplomacy and hasbara. I feel very strongly, though, and I have felt for years, that there's two key components that need to be that we need to reassess. Let's put it that way. Okay. Number one is not just let's start off with the speakers themselves, right? The spokespeople. If this was a private sector conversation that we were having, right? If we were representing Coca-Cola and Coca-Cola wanted to penetrate a new geography that they had yet to penetrate, what Coca-Cola would do is they would go into that geography. They would find the local expert that knew the language, that knew the nuance, that knew the culture, that knew how to sell something to those people, and that's who they would hire. For some reason, and I personally think that it's a terrible misconception here in Israel, and I felt this for many, many years. If you're trying to approach and appeal to a U.S. audience, then you need U.S. experts and U.S. spokespeople to speak to them. Just like if you were selling in Israel, you couldn't bring, I don't want to insult any foreign country, but, a Chinese PR firm to try and sell to Israelis, it just wouldn't work. The language is different, the culture, so on and so forth. So from my perspective, that is one change that we need to consider. We need to consider that when we're speaking to foreign governments and a public in a different country, that we recruit local experts and expertise and local spokespeople. By the way, some of our friends and some of our enemies in the region have adopted that strategy. Qatar, that is in the news all the time, and I'm not going to talk about their attempt to do something here in Israel, but you see it in the United States. They don't have Qataris. I mean, they do, but it's not just Qataris running around the United States speaking on their behalf. They'll recruit the likes of Tucker Carlson and many others who have audiences who know how to appeal to the local demographic. So I think that is something that we need to implement, and we need to think about in that direction. Number two is we as a country still look at this as a tactical problem and not a strategic one. We think that if we get better speakers, if we improve their talking points, then everything's going to change. And I don't believe that that's the case. I think that there needs to be a real significant and serious rethinking from a strategic perspective. What are our ultimate goals? Who are we trying to convince? What are we trying to convince them of? Which allies are we not tapping into yet that we can tap into? Public diplomacy is much more successful when you have very clear strategic goals. We tend to react and respond in tactical ways to strategic shifts, and I think that that's something else that really needs to change.
Ari, one of the things that I've heard from you on a few different occasions is how central politics are to the work of any prime minister. And in a sense, politics, in Israeli discourse, international discourse, sometimes politics is a dirty word. But the fact is that every prime minister wants to remain prime minister, thinks that she or he represents the right, ideology, the right priorities. And to remain prime minister, they need to engage in politics. An accusation, a claim that I heard from people in the U.S., from people in the Middle East, and obviously from people in Israel over the course of the last 2 years has been, well, the war could have ended earlier and the hostages could have come home earlier, but for Netanyahu, it was good for political reasons, for staying in power, for the war to continue. My response, by the way, has been, I have no idea what's in Netanyahu's heart, but there were very complex dilemmas and strategic challenges and good reasons why the war had to continue, and why the fact the war continued until when it did led to the outcome of getting nearly all the hostages back home and and Israel being able to remain in 53% of the Gaza Strip. So I want to ask you, first of all, about that accusation and what your thoughts are. And then secondly, looking forward to the coming year, the fact is that Hamas has not disarmed, controls Western Gaza. Hezbollah continues to try to rebuild its strength. There are many reports that Iran is rebuilding at least its ballistic missile production, if it's not its nuclear facilities. President Trump talked about its nuclear facilities. What role do you think the fact that we're heading into an election year, or we're already in an election year, what role might that have on Israel's decision-making regarding Gaza, regarding Lebanon, even regarding another war with Iran?
I'm familiar with that argument, and it's funny because what I tell people is that if the Prime Minister of Israel, I mean, I guess we're talking about him here. So if he walked into a doctor's appointment, and you know how when you walk in they give you the clipboard and they say, "Can you please just fill out this questionnaire before you come into the doctor?" And one of the questions is occupation, right? So his occupation is that he's a politician. Right? That is the definition of every single member of Knesset. They are politicians. So when people say, well, he's playing politics, yes, that is his job. His job is a politician. And I think that in any democracy, and definitely the way our democracy is structured, the person whose only job is to think about the military considerations around any such wars is the IDF chief of staff. The person that's in charge of setting Israel's economic, guidelines are, I guess, the head of the chairman of the Bank of Israel, and so on and so forth. The prime minister's job, together with the defense minister and other politicians, is to get that information from the various heads of, the different departments, and to take it all into consideration, meaning they take into consideration their foreign policy needs, their domestic policy needs, their economic needs, and political needs, and so on and so forth. And that is the way the system works. And it's not unique to Netanyahu. It is the way the system is built. So first and foremostly, I don't believe for a second that there's ever been a politician, not only in Israel, anywhere, that has been void of political consideration. That's their job, is to be politicians. Secondly, with regard to the specific example that you're referring to, I felt very strongly that argument weakened the state of Israel, because the greatest benefactor from that debate of whether or not Netanyahu is injecting politics into his decisions was Hamas. Okay? Hamas is the one that benefited from it, and there's been a lot of information that's come out to show that Hamas not only benefited from it, that they promoted it, that they pushed for that, for that line. And we've heard it even over the last few weeks from some of the released hostages that spoke about the fact that the demonstrations that were coming out to the streets and the arguments that were taking place that brought issues such as these to question were truly the line that they were pushing and were in their interests. I don't believe for a second that any prime minister of Israel, and this is not just Netanyahu, but I would say the same about the prime ministers before him and any prime minister after him, would put Israeli soldiers into harm's way just because they wanted to stay in power a little bit longer. Obviously, there is debate on any move and every move that is done in this country, right? If had he ended the war at that point, then people would have argued on the other side. Ultimately, the only body that had the ability to release the hostages was Hamas. So I don't ascribe to that argument that's made. Now, with regard to the upcoming elections and how potential military and security challenges play into that, that is definitely more tricky. There's no question, because again, even if it's just somewhere in the back of a leader's mind, does going to war after 2 years of war where the people are tired, you have really, I mean, I'll call it the elephant in the room, but it's not the elephant, it's out there, right, is the whole Haredi inscription topic, right, which is most likely going to be at the forefront of any future election. Now, is that something that, do you want to go to war when people will feel will feel their lack of support, the Haredi lack of presence in the military? Or do you want to stay away from something like that? Can you reach a successful conclusion before an election? There's other elements that play into that calculation as well. Something that would be seen as a successful and positive result for anyone seeking office would be a peace agreement, right? So does opening up a new or renewing battle allow Netanyahu to get closer to a peace agreement with, various countries that have been discussed, or does it, push it away? So there's no question that there is a political element that will seep into the debate, not only for Netanyahu, but the government as a whole. And by the way, let me just make a point that this is true to the opposition as well during this period, right? In other words, what do they benefit from? If they benefit from Israel going to war, then you'll see voices from the opposition sort of pushing the right to the right. If they benefit from Israel not going to war, then they're going to move the debate in that direction as well. So I think that ultimately we have to hope and pray that all of our leaders do the right thing in those situations, but it would be naive for us to ignore the political element completely.
Ari Harow, thank you so much. This has been very interesting. We'd love to have you on another time.
It was my pleasure, and great to see you guys. Thank you, Lahav, and thank you, Asher.
Thank you for listening. Make sure to subscribe, like, and follow Misgav at www.misgavins.org and on social media. You can send your comments, questions, and suggestions to Mideast Horizons podcast at gmail.com. And we'll be back next week.